Hi, and thanks for watching this message video. And don't forget to go through the life lesson that goes with it. And for those who can't make a Sunday, don't forget to listen to the podcast of that sermon that goes along with this message video and life lesson. Today, we're continuing on in our series where we're looking at the key differences between those who are followers and fans. And today, we're going to be focusing on leading, or being a person who leads others for Jesus or leads others to Jesus. Now, before I go any further, I want to point out that at the time of Jesus' death, his 12 disciples were still more fans than they were followers, even though he had been training them to be followers for nearly 3 years. I say this because even after Jesus' death and resurrection, they were still clinging to the idea that he was going to free Israel from the domination of Rome and reestablish Israel as a dominant nation. And of course, they were expecting him to lead them into epic battles, the same way that maybe King David had done, with ranks and files of leaders underneath him. And so keep that in mind when we see what it is that James and John, two of his disciples, decided to ask Jesus this. Mark 10:35 through 41. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do us a favor." "What is your request?" he asked. They replied, "When you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and the other on your left." But Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I am about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering I must be baptized with?" "Oh, yes," they replied, "we are able." Then Jesus told them, "You will indeed drink from my bitter cup and be baptized with my baptism of suffering. But I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. God has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen." When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. One of the biggest motivators in the disciples' lives at this point in time was that they still wanted to stand out amongst their peers and be honored by others. Or in other words, they wanted to be considered a big deal by everybody else around them, and they weren't alone in this. For instance, there was this one time when Jesus and his disciples were invited to dinner at the home of a prominent Pharisee, or a person who was known as a religious leader and teacher amongst the Jews at that time. Here's what happened at that dinner. Luke 14:7 through 11. When Jesus noticed that all who had come to the dinner were trying to sit in the seats of honor near the head of the table, he gave them this advice. "When you are invited to a wedding feast, don't sit in the seat of honor. What if someone who is more distinguished than you has also been invited? The host will come and say, 'Give this person your seat.' Then you will be embarrassed, and you will have to take whatever seat is left at the foot of the table. Instead, take the lowest place at the foot of the table. Then, when your host sees you, he will come and say, 'Friend, we have a better place for you.' Then you will be honored in front of all the other guests. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." In spite of Jesus' teaching at this dinner about self-exaltation and honor, all of the disciples were still angling towards that very thing, just like anybody in the world would normally do, because of ego. In fact, their egos were so ginormous, these guys were selfishly, consistently, seemingly looking for some sort of a benefits package that came along with being a part of Team Jesus. Again, here's another example of their ginormous egos. Mark 9:33 through 37. After they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you discussing out on the road?" But they didn't answer because they had been arguing about which of them was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him, and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." Then he put a little child among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." Much like the disciples, all of us have a selfish and egocentric nature that we have to overcome, which means all of us will struggle with wanting to be honored at some point, or will wrestle with a desire to be considered great amongst our peers to some degree. And the only way to overcome these selfish desires is by doing exactly what Jesus said, and instead of seeking honor from others or service from them, we're instead supposed to honor them by serving them. And notice that the example that Jesus gave was that he took a small child that belonged to somebody else and took it into his arms and welcome them. Now, I don't know about men back then, but men in our day, pretty much in general, most men do not naturally serve others unless it benefits themselves in some manner. And let's face it, many times there are very few personal returns or personal benefits when we are watching or serving or welcoming somebody else's small child into our arms or babysitting them. For instance, I don't hear too many people saying, hey, you know what, on my top 10 list of things to do this weekend is I want to watch somebody else's small child. But this is exactly what Jesus was saying to his disciples, is that if you want to be considered great, you want to be in the position of first, then be the person who welcomes a small child and serves them on my behalf. Because when you do that, you just not only welcome me, you welcome my Father. So back to this question that James and John had asked of Jesus. Clearly, these guys paid no attention to any of his teachings, blew right past them, were still focused on a position of leadership and prestige that would bring service to themselves. And so here's how Jesus responded to them. Mark 10:41 through 45. When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. So Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. Leadership amongst those who are followers of Jesus must be radically different from the leadership that this world promotes. For example, the leadership equation the disciples originally believed in was that leadership equals servants. And let's face it, when we're being honored or being served, we like that. It feels great. And there isn't a one of us that doesn't like to experience that. But we must resist the temptation to accept or embrace the world's definition of leadership and constantly pursue this. Instead, we must remember what Jesus said, and that we shouldn't be seeking honor. We shouldn't be self-exalting. Instead, we should be looking to honor others by serving them. Or in other words, the leadership equation Jesus consistently taught was that leadership equals service. So whether we see ourselves as followers, as leaders or not, really does not matter, because what Jesus wants from us is to understand that his leadership equation means not necessarily guiding others, directing others, commanding others, or making demands of others, or placing orders upon them, but instead what God wants from us as his leaders is to serve others and to honor them with the way that we live our lives, which is drastically different from the leadership equation of this world. And to help us stay focused on that throughout the course of this week, I'm going to suggest that everybody who considers themselves to be a follower of Jesus meditate as many times as possible on what the Apostle Peter said to us. 1 Peter 5:2 through 4. Care for the flock that God has entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. Don't lord it over the people assigned to your care, but lead them by your own good example. And when the great shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of never-ending glory and honor.